Today we will speak about the canon of the Old Testament. And I need to tell you that the theme of the canon of the Old Testament is a much debated issue. And the problem is that we do not have only one canon of the Old Testament, but we have many different canons. Like, for example, we have Hebrew canon, Greek canon, Latin canon, and Ethiopic canon. Many years later, in the time of Western Reformation in the Western Europe, Martin Luther raised the question of the canon again, and actually he excluded all deuterocanonical books from the Protestant Bible, or in other words, he came back to the Hebrew canon. So, what is canon? Probably all of you know that the word canon or the term canon came from the Greek word which means straight stick by which something is ruled or measured. And when we speak about the canon of the Bible, it refers to a list of books which are distinguished from all other books, and those books a religious community holds as uniquely authoritative in defining and teaching its essential beliefs. So let us now look at different canons of the Bible. And of course, we will start with the Hebrew canon. Hebrew canon consists of 24 books. In some sources, and we will see it later, some scholars defined Hebrew canon as consisting only of 22 books. But most probably it is because 22 is a very good number, because in Hebrew alphabet there are 22 letters. So probably ancient scholars, rabbis, wanted the books of the Hebrew Bible correspond, the number of the books in the Hebrew Bible correspond the number of letters in the Hebrew alphabet. And all of you probably know that Hebrew canon is divided on 3 parts. And these are law, Torah, the prophets, Nevi'im, and writings, Ketuvim, or in Greek it would be hagiographa. Actually, the abbreviation Tanakh comes from this division, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. And of course, Torah is the most important part of the Hebrew Bible. The prophet section is also very important, but it doesn't have the same status as Torah. Jews have a practice of reading one portion of the Bible every week. Thus, they divided Torah on 54 passages to have a one-year cycle of Torah reading. And this reading plan in Hebrew was called parasha or parashot. According to the Jewish tradition, during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, Torah was prohibited, so the Jews developed another reading plan, and it was called Haftorah. Haftorah was based on the reading from the prophets, and it proves that the prophets section of the Bible was also very important. And the prophets section includes 2 parts, former prophets and latter prophets. And the former prophets include 4 books, and these are the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, and 1st and 2nd Samuel as one book, and 1st and 2nd Kings also as one book. Latter prophets also include 4 books, and these are the book of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the minor prophets. And the minor prophets are also considered as one book because they were preserved at one scroll. And finally, we have the writing section, and it has 11 books. These are poetic books like Psalm, Proverbs, Job, the so-called 5 Megillot or 5 scrolls. And these are Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentation, Esther, and Ecclesiastes. And they called historical books like Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. but pay attention to the fact that they didn't include Daniel into the prophetic section, but included it into the historical books of the writings or Ketuvim. But we will talk about it a little bit later. So now we discussed the Hebrew canon, and we know what books were included into the Hebrew canon. So now let us move to a Greek canon. The Greek canon, or Septuagint, we know that the Septuagint is the translation of the Hebrew Bible into the Greek language. And this translation was performed starting from 3rd century and 2nd century before Christ. And most probably by the time of Jesus, it was already existed. And in Christian times, Christian in the 1st century AD started to use Septuagint very often as their own scripture, as their own Old Testament. Therefore, Septuagint was very often copied and transmitted mostly by Christians. In the Septuagint, in addition to 24 Hebrew books, there are a number of different writings which were not included into the Hebrew canon. And those writings received a name Deuterocanonical books. And now you can see the list of those writings at the slide. It's interesting that there were two canons, Western canon, and you can see it at the current slide, and also Eastern canon. And Eastern canon, in addition to those books which are listed here, have some more books, like Prayer of Manasseh, 1st Esdras, 3rd Maccabees, and also Psalm number 151. If we can speak about the Greek canon, so like Hebrew canon, Greek canon was divided on 3 parts. And these parts are the book of the historical books, and historical books included Pentateuch and historical books in our understanding of historical books, didactic or wisdom books. These are Psalms, Proverbs, Job, and the last section are prophetic books. It's very interesting that the Greek canon ended with prophetic books, probably because Christians, when they arranged books in such an order, wanted to show that prophetic section is continued with the New Testament. And do you remember that the last book of the Greek Bible is the book of Malachi, and Malachi is prophesying about the Elijah who is supposed to come. And the New Testament starts exactly from the same idea that the Greek Bible is finished. So now let us move to the Latin canon. And when we speak about the Latin canon, we need to tell about Vulgate. And Vulgate is a Latin translation of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament. And it's very interesting that before Vulgate was translated by Jerome, there was an Old Latin translation. But this Old Latin translation was a translation not from the Hebrew text, but from the Septuagint. And in the year 382, Pope Damascus I commissioned Jerome to revise the Old Latin translation. And Jerome, we need to give credit to this man, because he went to Palestine and he got a training from some of the rabbis in order to learn Hebrew language and in order to translate Bible into the Latin in a proper way. So because Jerome went to Palestine, so he wanted to translate only the Hebrew canonical books. But actually he was asked to translate as well some deuterocanonical books. And later on, after his death, those deuterocanonical books were added to the Vulgate. Actually, also I need to tell that one of his contemporaries, the Augustine, was the one person who opposed very much this idea of Jerome to have only the books in the Bible which are in the Hebrew canon. And he was the one, and later on we will see, who wanted to add some deuterocanonical books to the Latin Bible. And the last canon is an Ethiopic canon. And I need to tell you that Ethiopic canon is different from Greek canon and Latin canon, because in addition to all deuterocanonical books, the Ethiopic Bible has also the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, and also medieval history of the Jews written by Joseph ben Gurion. But we will not speak too much about Ethiopic canon, but we will discuss mostly Greek canon and Hebrew canon. So now let us speak about hypotheses that were proposed by different scholars in order to explain why those canons are so different from each other. And the first hypothesis, which is called Alexandrian and Palestinian canon, was suggested by a scholar by the name Peter Katz. And Peter Katz argued that the longer Greek canon was the Bible of the Jews of Alexandria, and the Hebrew canon was the Bible of the Hebrew or Aramaic-speaking Jews of Palestine. This idea seemed to be confirmed by the fact that the Palestinian Josephus, even though he was writing in Greek, but he used the books of only the Hebrew canon. But at the same time, Philo of Alexandria used not only the Hebrew canonical books, but also the Deuterocanonical books. This hypothesis of two different canons, Alexandrian and Palestinian canons, was very, very popular in the middle of the 20th century. But recently it lost much of support. So let us discuss the weaknesses of this hypothesis. First of all, we need to tell that there were no discussion about the difference about two canons, and we never find any mentioning of two different canons in any sources. Next argument is that the Hebrew canon differs not only in the content, so in the number of the books, but also in the order of the books or in their arrangements. And there is no explanation. At least this hypothesis doesn't provide any explanation for this difference. And probably the most important fact is that the Jews in Palestine were very much Hellenized. So, for example, if even we read the New Testament, we can see that many of the Jews had Hellenistic names, like Mark or some other names. And it was clear that they could speak Greek, and sometimes they could speak Greek even better than Aramaic language. So there is a question, if they could speak Greek so well, why they didn't use the Bible in Greek? So these are the weaknesses of this Alexandrian hypothesis. So now let us move on to a next explanation. And this explanation was suggested by another scholar by the name Albert Sandberg, and this hypothesis is called Jewish and Christian canons. And already from the title of this hypothesis, it is clear that Sandberg suggested that the Greek canon is a Christian canon, and the Jewish canon is the one that is preserved in the Hebrew Bible. Sandberg says that at the turn of the era, there was agreement among all the Jews regarding the canonicity of the Pentateuch and prophets, but not about the canonicity of the writing section. And the writing section was comprised from a big number of different writings. Different groups made different selections from this big number of religious literature without definite bounds or boundaries. So the Septuagint is a Christian selection from the Jewish works available around the turn of the era. The Christians arranged those books in such a way to demonstrate a movement from past history to eschatological fulfillment. And the Hebrew canon represents the work of rabbinic scholars who selected fewer books and arranged them so as to reflect their own religious system. It is clear that probably Alexandrian Jews tended to have a high regard for some books that were not regarded so high in the Palestine. But Sandberg says that it is anachronistic to say about the different canons for Palestine and Alexandria. So you can see that this idea or this hypothesis is a reaction on the previous hypothesis. So I want to repeat again. Main idea of Sandberg is that there were a lot of many books, and Jewish and Christian scholars at that time picked up those books that were considered good for them, and in this case we have two different canons, Jewish canon and Christian canon. The third hypothesis, which is called Hebrew canon, is equal to Greek canon, and this hypothesis was suggested by two scholars by the name Lehman and Beckwith, and both of them argue that the canon was complete for all the Jews and Christians before the Christian era. And they say that since the New Testament doesn't cite as scripture anything beyond the Hebrew canon, the Greek Bible must represent an amplification of the Hebrew Bible. And the Hebrew Bible at that time was already existed, and its canon was fixed. And this hypothesis is also a reaction to the previous one, and it opposes the idea that the Hebrew and Christian canon are different canons. Also, those authors suggest that, for example, in the book of Matthew, chapter 23 and verse 35, it says that the Pharisees were descendants of those people who shed righteous blood from the blood of innocent Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah. And actually this statement means from the beginning of the Bible to the end of the Bible, because Zechariah is mentioned in the second book of Chronicles in chapter 24. So they use this argument as an idea that to confirm the fact that during the time of Jesus, the Hebrew canon was already closed. And we know that the book of Chronicles is the last book in the Hebrew canon. So it looks like canon during the time of Jesus was already closed, and nothing was added after that to this canon. But of course, this theory also has some weaknesses. First of all, we need to tell that, for example, the argument that the writers of the New Testament never use any deuterocanonical books is not completely correct, because we have at least one exception. In the book of Jude, in verses 14 and 15, he refers to the first book of Enoch. And the argument from the reference to Matthew 23 and 35 is not a very solid argument, because not all manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible had the same order of the books. And for example, so very famous Codex Leningradensis has the Book of Chronicles in the beginning of the writings section. Okay, now let us consider the fact or the data about the closing of the Hebrew canon, because this one is very, very important. And there are several ideas or several hypotheses about when the Hebrew canon was closed. And one idea or one hypothesis says that it was closed in the 2nd century before Christ. And another suggestion is that it was closed in the 2nd century after Christ. So let us consider the arguments for the first and the second hypothesis. So let us consider first of all the arguments for early closing of the canon. And first of all, we need to mention that there are many evidences that Jews preserved their writings. And they preserved them because they consider them very important and inspired. For example, in the second book of Maccabees, we can read this passage. The same things are reported in the records and in the memoirs of Nehemiah, and also that he founded a library and collected the books about the kings and prophets and writings of David, and letters of kings about votive offerings. In the same way, Judas also collected all the books that had been lost on account of the war that had come upon us, and they are in our possession. So if you have need of them, send people to get them for you. So it's clear that in this passage, the author of the book of Maccabees says that already in times of Nehemiah, the books were collected and there was a library. And Judah the Maccabee, he tried to also to follow the example of Nehemiah, and he collected the books which were lost. So we can see that Jews really preserved their writings. And of course, they were supposed to know which writings are canonical or inspired by God, and which books are not inspired by God. One more interesting witness we can find in the writings of Josephus. And Josephus, in his book Against Apio, says, "We do not possess myriads or many of inconsistent books, conflicting with each other. Our books, those which are justly accredited, are no more than 22. And do remember, 22 is for Jewish people a very important number, because there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So, and they contain the record of all time. 5 of these are the books of Moses, comprising the laws and the traditional history down to the death of the lawgiver. This period falls only a little short of 3,000 years, from the death of Moses until Artaxerxes, who succeeded Xerxes as king of Persia, the prophets subsequent to Moses wrote their history of the events of their own time in 13 books. The remaining 4 books contain hymns to God and precepts for the conduct of human life. And he continues, we have given practical proof of our reverence for our own scriptures. For although such long ages have now passed, no one has ventured either to add or to remove or to alter a syllable, and it is an instinct with every Jew from the day of his birth to regard them as the decrees of God, to abide by them, and, if need be, cheerfully to die for them. And pay attention that Josephus says that the canon of the Hebrew Bible at his time, and he wrote about 70 years AD, and he said that the canon of the Hebrew Bible was already defined, and all Jews knew which books belong to canon. And also we have one more witness, and it is even older than the witness of Josephus, and it says, and it is written in the book of Ben Sira or Sirachus, and it says, the legacy of great value that has come to us through the law, the prophets, and the writers who followed in their steps. It looks like this quotation says that the division of the canon on law, prophets, and writers or writings was already established at this year. Let us now discuss the arguments for the late closing of canon. And first of all, we need to pay attention to the fact that not everywhere we can find witnesses of the three-partite division of the Hebrew Bible. For example, in the New Testament, we can find a lot of evidences for the two-partite division of the canon, namely the law and the prophet. For example, Matthew 5 and 17. Do you remember? Jesus says, I didn't come to abolish the law and the prophets. And we can find many other references to the same two groups of books, the law and the prophets. And evidently, when Jesus says this, he meant not only the law and the prophets, but he meant all scripture that had been written before. Another important issue is the evidences of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And among the Dead Sea Scrolls were found many different books, many different literature. And it's interesting that among those literature that was found in Qumran, there were not only the biblical books or manuscripts, but there were other deuterocanonical books. And also what is important, and this is the evidence of Talmud. One very important text is Tractat Baba Batra 14b, and in this tractat we can find the first Jewish tradition that identifies specifically the books of the Hebrew Bible. This text was originated in Babylon about 200 after the death of Christ. And what is important, that this tractate was not included into Mishnah. So it means that this tractate was not considered very authoritative at that time. And in this tractate we can find the clear division and in this tractate we can find the clear division on the three-part collection of the Hebrew writings, and this tractate mentions 24 books of the Hebrew sacred writings, which comprise the Hebrew Bible. Next important argument for the fact that the canon was not closed earlier than 200 of Common Era, or 200 after death of Christ, is the disputes among the rabbis about the canonicity of some of the books of the Hebrew Bible. Just for example, there is another tractate of Talmud, and it calls Yadayim, and the Hebrew Yad is a hand. So Yadayim is the hands. And this tractate discusses the issue of the defiled hands. And actually it is an euphemism, and because by this tractate, the rabbis discussed the issue of the uncanonical books. And they said that when a person reads uncanonical books or touches uncanonical books, so he defiled his hands. So they say that even touch the uncanonical books, if somebody touches the uncanonical books, he is defiled. And the rabbis prohibited to read anything except what was in the Hebrew Bible. But what is interesting, in this section, in the section Yadayim, the rabbis discussed the canonicity of such books as the book of Ecclesiastes and the book of Song of Songs. And some of them said that reading those books will defile the hands of the person who is reading them. So in other words, they would like to say that those books are not canonical, and nobody should read them. But other rabbis, on the contrary, defended the authority of those books, and we know that they were included into the canon. One more argument could be discussed in this case, and this is a hypothesis or tradition about the council in Jamnia or Jabne. According to Jewish tradition, during the siege of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, there was one rabbi, and his name was Johanan ben Zakkai. So he managed somehow to escape the city, Jerusalem, that was surrounded by Roman soldiers, and he was also able to enter the Roman camp and to get the audience with Vespasian. And during this audience, he greeted Vespasian as emperor. And Vespasian objected that he is not an emperor. And Johanan said that Vespasian would be the emperor. And actually, this prediction came true just in 3 days, because Vespasian in 3 days learned that he was proclaimed an emperor. Vespasian was very much impressed, and he granted Johanan any wish. So the first wish of Johanan was to lift up the siege of Jerusalem and leave the city. But of course Vespasian refuted, and he didn't fulfill this wish. But he suggested him to grant another wish. And Johanan asked to preserve the life of some rabbis. And Vespasian agreed, and those rabbis were able to leave Jerusalem and they went to the city of Jamnia or Jabne, and they established their rabbinical school. So, according to the tradition, in the year 19 of the Common Era, the rabbis gathered a council in Jamnia, and during this council they decided upon the canonicity of all books of the Hebrew Bible, and especially the books which were included in the writings or Ketuvim section. I need to tell you that this tradition recently was questioned, and in our days scholars do not believe that this council in Jamnia really took place. But this tradition has some rationale, because you see, Jewish religion was based upon the rituals in the temple. And after the destruction of Jerusalem and destruction of the temple, there was a danger that Jewish religion could disappear, because there was nothing, because their foundation was destroyed, the temple. And that is why the rabbis should find the way how to preserve their religion. And they decided to build their faith around the scripture. And from this point and on, their task was to preserve and to copy sacred writings. But in order to do this, they should know what books are canonical and what books they should preserve. So now let us evaluate the evidences that we have. I would like to remind you that we have two theories. According to one theory, Canon was closed just about 200 years BC, before Christ, and according to another theory, the Canon was closed much later, about 200 years after Christ. And we considered arguments in favor of one or another position. So now let us evaluate those arguments and evaluate all those evidences. And when we do the conclusion, we need to say and we need to admit that it is true that the writings section of the canon was not strictly defined. But it doesn't mean that the books of this section were not considered inspired. Most probably, at that time, the Jews have Torah and everything else. So it means that they have Torah, the division on Torah and everything else. And the writings were considered a part of prophets. For example, in the New Testament, we can find many quotations of the book of Psalms. And New Testament writers quote the book of Psalms as a prophecy about Christ. So at least the authority of the writings was not less than the authority of the prophetic books. The second argument or the second conclusion that we can do, we can assume that the authority of all books of the Hebrew Bible was recognized by the Jews already in times of Jesus. For example, Jesus quotes the book of Daniel as an authoritative prophetic book. If its canonicity was a disputed issue, there would be no sense to use it as an argument. The division between prophets and writings could emerge later. Most probably it was a result of the controversy between the Jews and Christians. The Christians used the book of Psalms and probably the book of Daniel to prove that Jesus is the Messiah. And as a response to that, the Jews differentiate between prophets and writings in order to diminish the status of writings. The third argument. Actually, the dispute disputes among the rabbis about the canonicity of some of the books from the writing section. Do you remember this, the tractate Yadayim? So these disputes among the rabbis actually could be the evidence that those books were already considered very authoritative. Otherwise, they will not be included into the Hebrew canon. Just imagine such book as Songs of Songs. In these books, the name of God is never mentioned. So there is a question: why did the rabbis consider it canonical and why did they include it into the canon? And the most evident answer is that the book Song of Songs was already considered canonical, and they just confirmed its authoritative status. And it's true that at that time they already have a Targum or Aramaic translation of that book, and it was translated into the Greek. So it means that it is already has a weight, has an authority. And the fourth conclusion: we do not know what criteria the rabbis used to define the canonical books, but most probably they were guided by the principle that the canon was closed not later than 200 BC, and all the books of later origin were not considered canonical. They even didn't include the book of Maccabees, which explains the origin of such festival as Hanukkah, the feast which was widely celebrated by the Jews in the times of Jesus. So we can say that actually the canon was closed before the time of Jesus. And now we can move to the next section and we can discuss the Christian canon. So it is very difficult to judge what books were considered canonical by the first Christians. We know that they extensively quoted from many books of the Hebrew Bible. And it is true that they almost never quoted from the deuterocanonical books, and the Epistle of Judah is the only exception. Later on, during the time of the second and third generation of Christians, the enmity between the Jews and Christians became more and more evident. Jews wanted to distance themselves from the Christians, and Christians did the same. As a result, the connection with Jewish tradition was lost. And a good example of this is Meleta from Sardis. Meleta was a bishop of Sardis, and he was a bishop around 170-180 years of Common Era. And one day he was asked by a member of his church about the contents of the scriptures accepted by the church. And what is interesting, he didn't know how to answer. So he made a trip to Israel, to Palestine, to find the answer. And look what Eusebius wrote about him. Actually, he quotes him. When I came to the east and reached the place where these things were preached and done, and learned accurately the books of the Old Testament, I set down the facts and sent them to you. These are their names: 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy; Joshua the son of Nun, Judges, Ruth; 4 books of Kingdoms; 2 books of Chronicles; the Psalms of David; the Proverbs of Solomon and his wisdom; Ecclesiastes, the Song of Songs; Job; the prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, the 12 in a single book; Daniel, Ezekiel, Ezra. From this I have made extracts and compiled them in 6 books. So this quotation already shows that actually Mileto of Sardis mentioned almost all canonical books, with some minor exceptions, for example, the Book of Wisdom of Solomon. And it means that already at that time the canon, that the Christian accepted the Hebrew canon. The Christian used Septuagint at the Old Testament, and this actually was a factor that caused that the deuterocanonical books became a part of the Christian Old Testament, because at that time deuterocanonical books were already a part of the Septuagint, and when Christians started to use very intensively the Septuagint as their own Bible, so they accepted the deuterocanonical books. However, even later on there were many attempts to come back to the Hebrew canon, and one of such attempts was done by Jerome, and we mentioned it earlier. He learned Hebrew language in order to provide a trustworthy translation of the Old Testament, and he argued for including only the Hebrew canonical books into Vulgate. Another good example is Athanasius the Great. He is the first church father who provided a list of all 66 books of the Bible. And I would like to read the quotation of his letter, and he is saying the following: "In proceeding to make a mention of these things, I shall adopt to commend my undertaking the pattern of Luke, the evangelist, saying on my own account." And he now trying to imitate the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. "Forasmuch as some have taken in hand to reduce into order for themselves the books termed apocryphal, and to mix them up with the divinely inspired Scripture, concerning which we have been fully persuaded, as they who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered to the fathers. It seemed good to me also, having been urged thereto by true brethren, and having learned from the beginning, to set before you the books included in the canon, and handed down and accredited as divine, to the end that anyone who has fallen into error may condemn those who have led them astray, and that he who has continued steadfast in purity may again rejoice, having these things brought to his remembrance." And he continues, "There are then of the Old Testament 22 books in number, for as I have heard, it is handed down that this is the number of the letters among the Hebrews, their respective order and names being as follows. The first is Genesis, then Exodus, next Leviticus, after that Numbers, and then Deuteronomy. Following this there is Joshua the son of Nun, then Judges, then Ruth, and again after this 4 books of Kings, the first and second being reckoned as one book, and so likewise the third and fourth as the one book. And again, the first and second of the Chronicles are reckoned as one book. Again, Ezra, the first and second, and similarly one book. After this there is the book of Psalms, then the Proverbs, next Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs. Job follows, then the Proverbs, the 12 minor prophets, being reckoned as one book, then Isaiah one book, then Jeremiah with Baruch, Lamentations, and the Epistle one book. Afterwards Ezekiel and Daniel, each one book. Thus far constitutes the Old Testament. So pay attention to the fact that Athanasius the Great says that already in his time somebody wants to mix up canonical books and not canonical books, and he provides a list of the books, and this list is very close to the Hebrew canon, again with some exceptions, like for example the book of Baruch and the epistle of Baruch or epistle of Jeremiah, and some other slight differences. So we can see that Athanasius speaks about the canonical books, and he mentioned only almost exclusively canonical books. So also many church fathers referred only to the canonical 24 books of the Old Testament. The tradition was stronger, and deuterocanonical books became a part of the Christian Bible. And there were several councils of the church, and especially in the Western Church, like for example the Synod of Hippo, and there are several other synods that try to include the non-canonical books into the Greek or Latin Bible. And during this council in the year 393, Augustine of Hippo was a very important figure because he influenced very much people who presided in this council, and he actually, as you remember, was opposing Jerome, who wanted to include only 24 books of the Hebrew Bible into the Latin Bible. So if make a summary of everything that was told so far, we can come to these conclusions. There are different traditions about the canon of the Old Testament. So do you remember there is Latin, Hebrew, and Greek, Ethiopic canons. And Jewish sources allow concluding that most probably the true canon, Hebrew canon, was already closed by the time of Jesus. Except canonical books, there were many other books of religious content, and those books were especially popular in Alexandria. While those books became a part of the Septuagint, they were accepted also by the Church. And there were many attempts to return to a true canon of the Hebrew Bible. But unfortunately, the tradition was stronger than the opinions of some church fathers. And only during the time of Reformation, the true canon was restored by the Protestant churches.